Hello everyone and welcome back. Today, as a follow-up to my last video, which was a look at my top 10 favorite fantasy standalone novels, I am going to go through my top 10 favorite adult fantasy series. This channel was created as a way for me to start reading more modern adult fantasy. I read almost exclusively adult fantasy as a child and teenager, and then started reading more widely, reading a wide variety of things, and fell behind on the up-to-date modern fantasy series. So I've had a really good time over the last year reconnecting with fantasy, finding some great modern fantasy series that I love and that have made their way onto this list. But I thought this would be a good chance for people who are new to the channel or people who kind of drop in intermittently to learn a little bit about my fantasy tastes. So I will go from 10 all the way up to my number 1 fantasy series. And I will get right into it because these can be very lengthy. So the number 10 spot on this list is taken by a series that is outside the range of fantasy that I typically read, and that is the Parasol Protectorate series by Gail Carriger. This is an urban steampunk fantasy series that follows a main character named Alexia Terabati, who's known as a soulless. So she is a person for whom supernatural creatures cannot have any impact. Her touch negates the powers of any supernatural creatures, including werewolves and vampires, which are kind of the two main types of supernatural creatures in this series. And that is thought to be because these supernatural creatures have an overabundance of soul, and she is soulless. This is a mashup of kind of steampunk, urban, historical fantasy, and there's a main mystery that drives the plot of the first novel. So the first novel is called Soulless, and it starts out by Alexia being attacked by a vampire at a high society function. And after that happens, vampires start to go missing from within London society. And Alexia teams up with Lord Mackin, who is the head of a werewolf clan. He is a member of the nobility, and he has a very antagonistic relationship with Alexia, but they team up to try to solve this mystery, and hijinks and a little bit of romance also ensue. This, like I said, is very outside my typical wheelhouse for what I enjoy reading in fantasy, but it was just a lot of fun. It was fresh, the dialogue was witty, I found the characters to be really funny, and I really enjoyed the central conflict and the central romance. This is 5 books long, and I would strongly recommend it to anyone who's looking for something a little lighter than some of those big, long, heavy series that we can become really embroiled in. It makes for a really light palette cleanser. The series all of the books have their own self-contained arc, so you can really read them like once a month or once every couple of months and kind of sprinkle them in between your other reads. But if you've never read them, then I would at least encourage you to read the first book, Soulless, because it can stand on its own. It has, like I said, a story that wraps up in that first volume, just to try it out and see if you would like it. It is not my typical fantasy fare, but I really ended up enjoying it, and I hope that maybe some of you who are watching will give it a try and end up enjoying it too. Number 9 on the list is one of the recent reads that I talked about, and that is Mark Lawrence's Book of the Ancestor trilogy. This trilogy follows a young girl named Nona who is embroiled in a prophecy that kind of stretches across the land that she lives in. So she lives in a fantasy landscape that is part of a corridor of essentially what is like a huge polar ice cap. So the world in which they live is ever shrinking, and humanity is trying to eke out an existence in this habitable corridor that exists. And there is a prophecy about someone who can control all of the main subtypes of magic that exist in this world. And so the upper nobility of this world have been trying to track down the person to whom this prophecy is referring. And so Nona, who is able to control various elements of this magic system, kind of gets carried away in that prophecy. She is taken in by a group of assassin nuns, which sounds a lot more exciting than it really ends up being in the book. But she is taken in and trained in this convent slash school where young girls are trained to be warriors and are trained to harness the various parts of this magic system. What I really like about this book is the very strong depiction of female characters. This is a very female-centric book. The members of this school or this training academy are all female. The instructors are female. And I really, really enjoy the way that Mark Lawrence builds the relationships and creates the dynamics between these characters. I think that Nona is one of the best fantasy characters that I have ever read. She is tenacious, she is strong, and she is fiercely loyal. That is probably the pillar of her personality. That is the most fundamental part of her, is how loyal she is to her friends and her family and those around her. And she is a character that it is very easy to root for and very easy to love. I think there's a good mix of character development and plot development in this book. Or in the series at large. I really enjoyed all 3 volumes. I think the second of the trilogy was probably my favorite, but I did find the ending to be very satisfying, and I enjoyed my journey the whole way through. I found these books very quick to flick through. The world building I found pretty balanced. It was not super extensive, but I also felt like I had a good idea of what the world was like, what the culture was like, how magic impacted the people around them, and it was just a highly enjoyable read. Nona is definitely what sets this apart. It is because of her character and how much I loved her character that these books made it onto the list. But if you enjoy strong female friendships, if you like unique fantasy settings, then I really would encourage you to pick this one up. Coming in at number 8 is Patrick Rothfuss's The Kingkiller Chronicles. This is one series that I feel could definitely rise in the ranks if and when the 3rd volume of the trilogy is ever released. The Kingkiller Chronicles, as I'm sure all of you know, is the story of Kvothe, who is a young man who at the beginning of the story is in hiding under an assumed name. He is the very definition of an unreliable narrator, but basically over these books we follow him as he tells his life story to a chronicler who has tracked him down and has come to find him to hear about his courageous deeds and his misdeeds. Kvothe has admitted to taking part in the downfall of monarchies, of slaying rulers, and we journey through the story of his life to find out how and when he was involved in these particular events. This is a kind of a mishmash of various fantasy tropes. We have the coming of age story as we follow Kvothe from the time that he's a young child into his period of time at university. This is a story about stories, which is how Patrick Rothfuss himself describes it. It's about how legends build and how we retell or how we interpret our own stories. And I think one of the main driving factors of what has made this such a beloved series is the writing style itself. Patrick Rothfuss has a very beautiful style of prose. It is not overly flowery, but he is able to convey a huge depth of emotion through his words. Music plays a big part in this series. Kvothe is a very gifted musician, and when Patrick Rothfuss writes about music, those are some of the most beautiful passages that I have read in fantasy. This series also, I think, elicits a lot of ire from its readers because unfortunately the 2nd volume of the trilogy was released 10 years ago and there is not a lot of information about when the 3rd will come. I have blocked a little bit of it out of my mind. I've been kind of purposefully not thinking about it and just biding my time, waiting for the 3rd volume to come out. I am still very much a fan of this series. I will definitely be reading the 3rd book upon its release, but I understand that there is a huge level of frustration for people who, like myself, have been waiting for these books to finish for, the last 10 to 15 years. But I loved these books so much. Kingkiller Chronicles was kind of my first foray back into adult fantasy. I read it at a time in my life when I was under a lot of stress. I was right in kind of the middle of medical school. It was very busy. I didn't have a lot of time to do anything except study and be at the hospital. And this totally transported me out of there. And I will always really love it for that. To move along, we will hit on the only work of science fantasy that is on this list, and that is Pierce Brown's Red Rising series. So this has been getting, I think, a bit of a resurgence on BookTube lately. It seems like a lot of the people, at least a lot of the people that I follow along with, have been reading Red Rising either for the first time or rereading it, but there's a lot of talk about Red Rising, which I am really happy about because it is one of my favorite series of all time. Back when I was in medical school or when I was in residency, I had been reading a lot of YA fiction or a lot of YA fantasy because it was very quick. The books were a lot shorter, very action focused, and so they didn't take a lot of time to get through. And when the first book in this series, which is called Red Rising, was released, it was actually marketed as a YA story. A lot of the YA booksellers that I followed on Twitter, a lot of the YA readers or bloggers were reading this book. And I would just like to say, before I say anything else, that this is definitely not a YA series. This is a brutal, gruesome book that explores what it means to be in power, what it means to hold power over others, what makes a successful society. Does there need to be a cast of people that are subjugated in order for the rest of society to thrive? There's a lot of really complex questions that are asked in this book, and the actual content gets progressively darker as the series progresses. This is a kind of double trilogy. So we had the original Red Rising trilogy, and now we have the second trilogy, of which 2 of the 3 books are released, and we're expecting book 3 sometime in the next couple of years. And they follow a main character named Darrow, who was born into the lowest class of his society. This society is organized by color, and Darrow is a part of the red class, which is kind of the working class, and he is confined to the planet of Mars, where he is digging for, I don't remember the name of the element because it's been such a long time since I read these, but he is mining for some sort of element that is important for the rest of society. And Darrow and the rest of the Reds are really kept in the dark about what the rest of society looks like, what the rest of humanity is doing. And there is unfortunately a very tragic incident that takes place in Darrow's life, and this kind of propels him into a revenge plot where he is recruited to become one of the ruling class members of society, which are the gold class. So he is recruited to become one of these golds and to infiltrate gold society. And so we follow Darrow's journey as he goes from being this hot-headed red to being a member of this elite society. And we watch as his opinions, his perspective, his knowledge of the world expands, and we watch him change in ways that we would have thought impossible in the first book. As I said, these are really complex books. There's a lot to be discussed here. I think Pierce Brown is an obvious fan of the classics. There's a lot of classical allusions that are interwoven into this work, and he obviously tackles a lot of political theories or political concepts about what makes a successful society. Is democracy a workable society? And they're really, really, really interesting to follow. I have the unpopular opinion of the most recent book, Dark Age, being my least favorite of the series so far. But that is because I struggle with kind of the grimmest of grimdark, and that book was one of the darkest that I have ever read. That being said, I am very much looking forward to the conclusion of this series, and I definitely rank it amongst my favorite series of all time. Coming in at number 6 is a very new series for me, and that is John Gwynn's The Faithful and the Fallen series. I have read all of the books in this series this year, but they were probably the most fun that I have had reading maybe since I was a kid. They are action driven, they are plot driven, they follow a huge cast of characters. This is a multi-POV story that follows essentially what is John Gwynn's take on the good versus evil trope. And John Gwynne in this series of books takes a number of really common classic fantasy tropes that have been inspired by authors like David Gemmell, and he really twists them and brings a modern and fresh perspective to those stories that we know so well. If you are a lover of the fantasy classics, if you enjoy action-focused fantasy, if you enjoy that epic sort of battle-inspired fantasy, then I really think that you would like this series. John Gwynne's prose is very straightforward. It propels you through the narrative, and these are just breakneck speed. I read 3 of these like massive 600 to 700 page books in a weekend. I could not stop reading them. I feel like Gwynne knows the perfect balance between action and quiet character moments. His characters have so much heart, you have no choice but to fall in love with them. There are series that I have read that have had more complex or more nuanced depictions of characters, which I also really love, but these characters are just so enjoyable. You will hate the villains beyond any character in a book that you have ever hated before, and you will love and cheer for and wish for the heroes to succeed. This is not a book where it's difficult to love the good guys or hate the bad guys. There's not as many of those shades of gray as you find in modern fantasy, but it was just so enjoyable. I loved every minute of reading these books, and I have no doubt that this will be a series that I will reread many, many times into the future. For number 5, we will kick back to one of my classic fantasy loves, and that is the Arthurian Saga by Mary Stewart. So this is a collection of novels that begins with the Crystal Cave, and this, of all of the Arthurian retellings that I have read, of which there have been many, this has long been my favorite. This is a retelling of Arthurian legend that focuses on Merlin, who is my favorite wizard character. I apologize to Gandalf, but Merlin wins it for me. So we follow Merlin as he grows from small child into the figure that he will become, and we watch the role that he plays in the development of Arthur and his legend. I find Merlin to be a very interesting character because it can definitely be the villain of the story. He is regarded as a hero or a mentor character, and I think that there are a lot of shades, a lot of facets of Merlin that are interesting to explore. You know, depending on what version of the myth that you are reading, he could be the person who helps enable the sexual assault of Arthur's mother, or he could be the person who provides the people with the King Arthur, with the savior, with the person who will establish Camelot and bring peaceful rule to Britain. So there are a lot of different perspectives that you can take on Merlin, but what I love about this series is that it blends the fantastic with a writing style that almost reads like historical fiction. Mary Stewart has beautiful writing. These books suck you in immediately, and I really, really enjoy them. If you like Arthurian legend, if you like historical fantasy, if you like those kind of soft magic systems or the blending of fantasy and historical fiction, then I would highly recommend that you check out this series. Coming in at number 4 is a series that has probably my favorite fantasy character of all time, and that is Robin Hobb's The Farseer trilogy. This is a newer read for me. I read these within the last couple of years, and I have to say that the character of Fitz, so he is the main character of these stories, he completely and utterly captured my heart. I don't think that there is anybody that I have read in fantasy who creates characters with such emotional depth, with such psychological complexity, with such realistic actions, who make mistakes and who will frustrate you and anger you as much as they elicit your sympathy or your empathy. As we follow Fitz through the Farseer trilogy, you will be run through a host of emotions. You know, there are times where you will be annoyed at Fitz, where you will be happy for him. A lot of times you will just be really sad for him because Robin Hobb puts him through so much. But I loved these books so much because of the love that I had for Fitz. That's not to say that I didn't enjoy the story, because I did. I really enjoyed the magic. This is a very soft magic system in the Farseer trilogy. There's the integration of animal companions, and there's even a facet of the magic system that is a link between humans and animals, which I really, really love. But Fitz is really the runaway here. He is the part of this series that makes it so enjoyable. And I really, to be honest, have been dragging my feet on continuing in the realm of the Elderlings, because I know that the next trilogy doesn't focus on Fitz. Now, I have heard that these books just get better and better as they go on, so I definitely want to continue. It's just that the Farseer trilogy made such an impact on me. I loved it so much that I find it hard to move on from here. And I know that that's silly, because the path will eventually bring me to more books about Fitz, but I can't help the way that my brain works. But if you have not picked up the Farseer trilogy, if you have been holding back for any reason, then I obviously really encourage you to pick those up. Now we break into the top 3, my 3 favorite adult fantasy series of all time. Number 3 is another newer fantasy series that I have picked up, and that is Joe Abercrombie's First Law trilogy. So the First Law has expanded. There is the First Law trilogy, there are a number of standalone novels, and then there is the second kind of sub-series within this group, and I have only read as far as the First Law trilogy. However, only reading those 3 books was enough to cement Joe Abercrombie as one of my favorite authors who is writing right now, and it was enough to bump the First Law trilogy to number 3 on my favorite fantasy list of all time. These are character-focused books, these are character-driven books, and we follow a cast of characters that are so lifelike and so morally gray that each one of them is so fascinating to follow. The main characters that we follow in this original trilogy include Glokta, who is a torturer who works for the crown. We follow Jazal, who is kind of a pretty boy, who is an expert swordsman and is looking for nothing more than glory and women and for people to look up to him. And we follow Logan Ninefingers, who is a man of the north. He is a fighter with a shady, kind of dark and dangerous past that unfolds as the book carries on. All 3 of these characters are phenomenal. Glokta is a fan favorite for many, many people's favorite fantasy character of all time. I will say that he was my least favorite of the 3. I recognize that that is an unpopular opinion, but saying that he is the least favorite of those 3 characters is like picking, I don't know, my least favorite of 3 different kinds of ice cream. Like, it's ice cream. It's all delicious. It's the First Law. All of these characters are fantastic. And not only are they fantastic characters, but they are so distinct. You could pick up this book and open it up, and you would know within the first sentence if you were reading from Jazal's perspective or Logan's perspective or Glokta's perspective. Joe Abercrombie has such a unique voice that he is able to lend to each of these characters. And while the plot in these books is pretty straightforward, the character motivations following these characters as they work their way through the events of the trilogy is so satisfying and so rewarding. I am really, really looking forward to pushing forward in this series, and I will be picking up the first book in the standalone novels, which is called Best Served Cold, very, very soon. And from there, we get to my final 2, my top 2 fantasy novels or series of all time. And if you probably have even watched only one video on this channel, you know the books that are going to come up. And coming in place number 2 is Stephen King's The Dark Tower series. This is the fantasy series that I probably have the most love for. I have never loved a group of books as fiercely as I loved the Dark Tower series. And it's funny, I started reading these books when I was probably around 12 or 13 years old. And so I had read the first 4 and then had to wait for book 5 to be released. And this was nothing compared to the torture that people who had been constant readers from the very first volume, they had a much longer wait than I did. But even the process of waiting for these books, it takes on an almost magical quality in my memory. I loved all of these books from the first time that I had read them. I remember the very first time that I read The Gunslinger and what an impact it had on me. It was such a blend of genres. It was fantasy, but it was also science fiction and horror and a dystopian novel and a Western, and it integrated so many of the things that I love. I watched a ton of Westerns with my dad when I was little. I really enjoyed that vision of kind of the wild, unconquered land of these anti-heroes, really, that had a moral code, and they had things that they stood for, but they didn't always carry things out in the best way, or in the way that would be looked on as making them a good guy versus a bad guy. And I found that in Roland Deschain, the main character of The Dark Tower. He is the very epitome of an anti-hero. He is obsessed with the tower. His quest for the tower has taken over his entire life, has destroyed his relationships, has become a fundamental part of his identity. And watching him on his quest as he adds to his quartet, or his group of people who are fated to travel together, I fell in love with all of the characters in this book. I love the journey. I have loved the ending, which is very divisive in both the the constant readers and just the casual readers of The Dark Tower. I have loved everything about this book since the very first time that I read it through. The only letter that I have ever written to an author was to Stephen King when I finished this series, because it had such a profound impact on me. And it's a very strange experience to come on to BookTube and to hear other people talk about their love for The Dark Tower. I grew up in a really isolated place, and nobody read the same kinds of things that I read. The only other person that I knew had read The Dark Tower for most of my younger years and adolescence and into early adulthood was my dad. And for that reason, these books, they felt like they were mine. Like, they felt like books that were written for and created for me, which is obviously like the narcissistic delusions of a teenager. But that's the way that I felt. I felt like that this was something that was crafted specifically for me. And I have never felt that depth of emotion or attachment for a fantasy series since then. This is not going to be the series for everyone. I can understand that, and I can understand some of the qualms that people have when they talk about The Dark Tower, but I really, really think that Stephen King accomplished something with this series that has not been done and probably will not be replicated in fantasy, period. End of discussion. And that may be to your taste, or you may think that it is completely batty, like out there, you would never want to read it, but I love it. It is obviously one of my favorite series of all time, and I would encourage anybody to pick up the first couple of books and just give it a try and see where it takes you. And moving on from there, I guess there's only one other place to go, and that leaves my favorite fantasy series of all time ever, bar none, as J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. If you want to get technical and say that The Lord of the Rings is a single book, then we could make the series The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, the extended works. I love them all. My dad read me The Hobbit when I was 5, as I said in my favorite fantasy standalones video, and I read The Lord of the Rings for the first time when I was 10. And probably for a number of years after that, they were the only thing that I read. Lord of the Rings was my first brush with fandom. I joined fan sites. I wrote Lord of the Rings poetry. I have old Lord of the Rings poetry that I wrote at like age 11 or 12 up in my bedroom upstairs. My kids get they get a kick out of reading it. I feel like, whereas the Gunslinger, the Dark Tower books, I have this depth of love and emotion, and I felt like they were written for me. The Lord of the Rings I view as a fundamental part of the person that I am. They completely took over a portion of my early life that really formed a lot of my tastes. It formed the types of books that I wanted to read, the integration of language, the exploration of culture and language in these books led me to my first degree, led me to my arts degree, led me to study other languages. The types of stories that I still enjoy reading, that hero's journey, that epic quest, those are things that I will never stop loving. You know, I don't care that they are tired, classic fantasy tropes. I will always love them. Lord of the Rings inspired so many of the authors that I love. Without Lord of the Rings, we wouldn't have the Dark Tower series. I wouldn't have those other favorite series of mine. J.R.R. Tolkien changed the face of an entire genre. He helped grow an entire genre with his work. And just as it is fundamental to fantasy as a whole, I feel like it is fundamental to the reader that I am. I don't know that there is ever a fantasy series that could usurp the Lord of the Rings from this primary spot on my list, because I feel like the Lord of the Rings is just part of who I am. It has developed part of my personality, part of myself as a reader and as a person, and I cannot detangle the threads of the Lord of the Rings that are woven into the part of me that loves reading books and loves reading fantasy. This is the ultimate epic adventure, and if you have not read Lord of the Rings, if you have not yet embarked on that journey, then I think that you should start, and I really hope that you enjoy it. This is, again, a book that is so hard for me to look at objectively. It's hard for me to talk about, hard to explain, because it is just a fundamental part of me. It is a love that I could not get rid of if I tried. It is a cliched answer for your favorite fantasy series, but I can't help it. That it has been that way, and so it will continue to be. But I hope that you enjoyed this video. I hope that this was interesting. And like I said, now if people want to know more about my personal fantasy tastes, then hopefully they can take a look at that. They can look at this video and maybe understand the types of things that I enjoy reading. I would love to hear some of your favorite fantasy series, some that we share, some that are completely different. I always love hearing about the things that you love to read, and I will see you with another video soon. Bye.